and welcome to the Ultra in Conversation with. And I'm pleased to welcome back Neil Sanders of Some Dare Call It Conspiracy, who is joining me today to speak about a pretty specific area, which I know many of you will be interested in. Hello, Neil, and thank you for joining me again.
Hello, thank you very much for inviting me back.
Not at all, pleasure to have you. Now, Neil, we're going to be talking about MK Ultra, the human experimentation program that was organized by the CIA, reportedly starting, I think, in the 50s.
Yeah.
And mind control. And also we'll be exploring the links with narcissism and the use of manipulation. So perhaps for people who aren't familiar, could you perhaps provide me with an overview of MK Ultra?
Well, MK Ultra was a sort of broad term for several projects that were brought together: Bluebird, Artichoke, and various other delineations. The long and short of it was they started actually in 1947 with a program called Chatter, and the point of Chatter was to use truth serums, or the flip side of that, to try and create some sort of drug or process by which, if a person was captured, they wouldn't be able to be interrogated, and so that's what they were interested in. When Bluebird started in sort of 1951, that was more concerned with assassinations, and what they were trying to do was the stated purpose was, can we make a person do something that goes against their own moral code and even against their own sort of self safety? So you know, convincing somebody to, I don't know, be a suicide bomber or an assassin or something like that. And so that started in 1951, and then in 1953 they sort of brought everything together under the sort of the broad heading of MK Ultra, and it was started by, or it was sent to an agency within the CIA called the TSD, or the Technical Services Division, but they were known within the CIA as the Department of Potions and Dirty Tricks, and they were involved in all sorts of things like the assassination of Castro. They tried to put some plastic explosives in a conch shell to kill him whilst he was scuba diving. They tried to put radioactive material in his toothpaste so that his beard would fall out, and this would apparently be like a huge embarrassment to him. They tried to assassinate him with all sorts of different sort of methods, and they failed. And so there was a chap called Sidney Gottlieb who was the head of this division, and he was appointed by Alan Dulles of the CIA to basically bring all of this together, and it incorporated all sorts of things. There were doctors that were used in America. There were doctors that were used in Canada. There were experiments that were done on the military, members of the general public. There's even some sort of crossover to the UK. There were certain institutions and doctors that were doing things in the UK that was supposedly like therapeutic, but actually involved wiping of the mind or reprogramming patterns, is what they would call it. And this seemed to directly feed into doctors that were working under the CIA, but actually in Canada. And the reason that they moved a lot of it out of America was for plausible deniability, because they're experimenting on human beings, and often with fatal or catastrophic results.
Okay. Now, so it started off with thinking about how can we create a truth serum, and then also how we can sort of almost activate an asset so that they, almost like an automaton, just go in there and.
Very much. Have you ever seen the film The Manchurian Candidate?
I mean, obviously that's what my next sentence was going to be. Yeah. So that would be the idea.
That's obviously it's fiction, but it gives you the concept, the idea that either through the use of drugs, hypnosis, forced socialization, or the use of certain devices or machines, that you can either alter the personality of somebody or imprint a personality on top. For example, in the case of I know this is fictional, but it is actually based on certain declassified documents. In the Manchurian Candidate, the chap who's the assassin doesn't know that he's an assassin, and so whenever he's sort of put into this altered state, he he sort of acts out whatever he's instructed to, but his core personality has no knowledge of that. And that was actually done. That was done mostly via the use of hypnosis, with people like George Estabrooks, J.G. Watkins, Morse Allen, various people like that were able to induce all sorts of crazy activities. For example, Morse Allen, he actually was trying to convince the CIA of the sort of validity of these sorts of things using hypnosis. So he produced a video called "The Secrets of the Black Arts," and in this video that was played to various members of the CIA and military, it basically it stole the plot from the Manchurian Candidate. It showed a Chinese gentleman that was able to induce people into sort of hypnotic states and then use them for his own nefarious ways. But Morse Allen himself did experiments with CIA personnel, and they were they ranged from getting people in a hypnotic trance to go and steal things, to getting people in a hypnotic trance to plant things that could have been bombs or such. The most impressive experiment was there was two young ladies sat at a table. Both had expressed a fear of firearms. They're just not keen on guns. So they work in the military, but they're like secretaries or whatever.
Mm-hmm.
He put them into a trance state, and then he basically put a gun on the table, and he told one of the ladies, kill the other lady, and she picked up the gun and just fired it straight at the woman. There was no bullets in it, but she wasn't aware of this. And then
Yeah.
when we both came out of trance, neither of them had any knowledge of what had happened, but it had been recorded. And similarly, people were induced to put their hands into like beakers of acid, or to pick up poisonous snakes, or to do all sorts of bizarre things that
Mhm.
normally they wouldn't do under the sort of influence of this hypnosis.
With people that would do such a thing, who ordinarily, as you've just pointed out there, have an aversion to a firearm, but then in a hypnotic state would pick it up.
Mm.
Was there any research undertaken into the most susceptible individuals for this? Could you categorize them, or is anybody susceptible?
It depends. It depends on right, because here's the thing, and there was a very famous hypnotist who was actually working seemingly with the UK, potentially during World War II, which obviously predates all of the American sort of programs and such like that. This is a chap called George Estabrooks, and he was a very powerful hypnotist. Now, in hypnosis, I used to be a clinical hypnotherapist. And now, what they'll tell you in hypnosis is that you cannot get somebody to do something that they wouldn't normally do. So, if murder's not in their nature or whatever, the argument is because that you couldn't get somebody to do that, because when people tend to turn up for hypnosis, even on a therapeutic level, they're like concerned that, oh, you're going to uncover all these horrible memories, or you're going to turn me into a chicken or something like that. And
Yeah.
you're essentially going to control me. And that's not really how it works. 9 times out of 10 in the use of therapeutic hypnosis, the hypnotist doesn't hypnotize you. They create the circumstances where you allow yourself to go into a state that could be described as hypnosis, which is essentially just an incredibly relaxed state.
Mhm.
However, what George Estabrooks said was there is a myth that you cannot induce people to do anything that they would not normally do, which is murder, suicide, etc., etc. And he says that this is a total myth. And how did he know this? Because he'd been able to do it. So what he says is that basically there's certain ways that you can induce essentially anybody. You can and it all is this is the really nefarious nature of it. It's down to rapport and trust. If you can create a huge amount of rapport and trust with the client, then essentially induction is far greater. Now, at the opposite end of the spectrum, you can use fear, you can use things like keeping people awake, keeping people sort of hungry for days on end, lowering their sort of capacity to resist and stuff like that.
Yeah.
So you certainly can break people down and make them more malleable by that. But what Estabrooks was saying is essentially, once you've got this rapport, you can convince people to do things in 3 ways. One, you can change context of what they're doing. So, for example, it's wrong to kill a person, but if that person over there has got a button that will destroy the entire planet, then basically it would be a moral thing to do to kill that person, and you couldn't argue with that. So you could convince somebody to do an immoral act by changing the context. The second way that you could do that is by changing the arena in which they're doing it. So if you say to somebody, see this gun, go and shoot that person in the face, it's a water pistol, they'll find it really amusing, and they'll do that because they'll think it's a water pistol. The third way that you can convince people is, and this is the worst, by being so nice to them that they don't think that anything that you do would go against their self-interest. So let's imagine you've been to a therapist or somebody where you really trust. You've been with them for weeks and weeks and weeks and weeks or weeks, just for example. And then say I'm the therapist and I say, HG, I want you to run at that window. And you go, but we're on the 10th floor. If I run at that window and go crashing through it, I'm bound to die. But then what your brain will do is go, but the thing is, Neil knows that, and Neil is my friend, and there's no way that Neil would do anything that would lead to my harm. So I'm going to trust him. And so you go running through the window and you go crashing to your death. And so through those 4 techniques, the 3 techniques that Esther Brooks suggested, and then the 4th technique, which is essentially wearing somebody down through isolation and overstimulation, and this is what they do in, say, Guantanamo Bay, or I know it's closed now, but various places like Camp X-Ray, tortured sort of extraordinary rendition sites. There was a manual called the Kubark document that actually came from these types of experiments, and it found out that the best way to make somebody ridiculously easily manipulatable is to isolate them and overstimulate them. And I think I might have briefly touched on this the last time we spoke about this, but like one of the ways that in the modern society everybody's isolated and overstimulated is through social media, because you're on your own, but you've got all of this information coming at you. And so, there are some people who would suggest that that's not a coincidence.
In my experience, I found that getting people's buy-in to what you want them to do is ultimately far more effective than the breaking them down route. Although the breaking them down route is rather entertaining to see the results of it.
Yeah.
But if you can get somebody who is aligned with your principles and whilst they might not be a true believer, they become reliant upon that they buy into what you're suggesting and start to believe it. To my mind, that is more powerful, because ultimately they feel like they're making a choice as opposed to being forced to do it.
Yes, no, absolutely. It's the concept it's the sales concept, isn't it, of building rapport. Yeah. I'm not selling something to you. I'm doing you a favor because you're my mate. And by the time you've figured out that actually, hang on, I didn't even need that at all, and I've bought 5 of them. Yeah. It's too late. And that's absolutely correct. And they tried both types. They tried doing things with soldiers who'd sort of signed up for stuff, and they also tried just sort of even going so far as to just like spiking general members of the public with acid or LSD and mescaline and scopolamine, various other sort of like mind altering chemicals.
LSD was used pretty heavily, wasn't it?
Oh, hugely, yeah, including on members of the public. Have you heard of a thing called Operation Midnight Climax?
No, I think I've watched it as a dodgy film once. But,
well, there you go.
Tell me about that.
The title of it shows that the CIA had at least an inkling of a sense of humor. Operation Climax was it was in San Francisco, and it was ran by an agent called George Hunter White. And George Hunter White was a maniac and also an alcoholic. And what he would do, he'd set up this hidden room in a brothel behind a 2-way mirror. With a toilet, essentially just a toilet, because he's in there for ages, and bottle of whatever liquor that he went through, and he'd go through like something mental, like 2 bottles of whiskey or vodka a night or something crazy like that. Anyway, what they were doing was they paid these prostitutes to essentially dose up their clients. Every time the clients would come in, they'd mix them a drink or whatever, and they'd put LSD into it. And this was purely so that George Hunter White could watch what happened and record it. And there was one famous instance where one gentleman was like, "You've just dosed me with acid." And they expected him to get cross, and he was like, "No, no, no, you know, I'm quite partial to a bit of the old LSD. Have you got any more?" And this bloke apparently just had a whale of a time. Just basically, they just kept dosing him up and dosing him up and dosing him up for days and days and days on end, whilst they sort of took notes, really. George Hunter White used to call LSD Stormy, was his own particular nickname for that, and this was because of the reaction that it caused. And one of the things that he used to do, which indicates what sort of maniac he was there was a particular road in San Francisco that was like a boulevard with like restaurants on either side, like open front restaurants. And what he'd do is he'd walk up and down, and on any opportunity, he'd drop acid into somebody's drink. And then he'd sit at his favorite restaurant, at his particular table at his favorite restaurant, and just watch people start to freak out. And just, yeah, so the guy was there was a culture at the time within the CIA where everyone was either taking acid themselves and enjoying it, or they were dosing each other. And this even went up to sort of in the early 70s. There was a rumor that the entire Nixon entourage was dosed with LSD whilst they were on a visit to Russia. And this was sort of, shortly after the Cold War and blah, blah, blah. So this was like, that's probably not a very good idea, but
No.
but stuff like that actually happened. The worst incident, or the incident that caused this to all sort of come to the forefront, was the investigation into the death of a chap called Frank Olson. Frank Olson was involved sort of peripherally with MK Ultra, and somebody gave him some acid without him knowing, and a few days later, he apparently jumped to his death from the window of a hotel. Although there are certain theories that actually he was thrown out. But there's all sorts of questions. The long and short of what actually happened, or what is the most likely, is that he witnessed an interrogation scenario whereby some of these mind control techniques were tried on enemy troops that were held at some military prison somewhere, and when it didn't work, they were just shot and buried. And he obviously sort of he's essentially sort of quasi-civilian. He's not really that type of army. Do you know what I mean? And this really sort of like disturbed him. And then later, many years later, his children were looking into his death, and that uncovered quite a lot of the sort of the things about how they were using LSD and even against say civilians.
To what extent Neil, did they believe how the LSD would actually help? To my mind, somebody going on an acid trip, they're just as likely to see monsters everywhere as they are to supposedly start being more malleable.
Well, sorry, go on.
Yeah, so to me, it's whilst I appreciate they were testing it to see where it would go to, it strikes me as that the level of control that you would have, was subject to being rather random.
And that was essentially what they found. Like, they hoped that it would be a non-lethal weapon of war that could either induce people into malleability or confuse people to the point where it was pointless. And there was an incident in Pont Saint-Esprit in France, right? Okay, where the official story is that basically some corn went moldy, and there's a type of seed called ergot, and that was the precursor for LSD. And so the idea is that basically this caused like a bit of madness to go in this particular village in France. Now the conspiracy theory around that, and there's a degree of evidence that supports this, is that actually there was an aerosolized LSD sort of experiment that was done by America, and that was the result of it. But as you said, this is essentially why they abandoned the use of LSD and started using or trying to use different drugs or different methodologies and stuff like that. I mean, for example, they were using scopolamine and I can't remember the other one. Dentists sometimes use it, Thorazine, and things like that in interrogation scenarios. They also were doing things like getting people hooked on heroin, and then basically, not giving them the drugs so that they would start to get the withdrawal symptoms. And but a lot of
the French Connection did.
Hey, I was just about to say the French Connection, yeah. And but again, the problem with that, and this is again the problem that they've found with when you look at, say, torture devices, and like, particularly, say, torturing of people who can connected to, say, Al Qaeda or ISIS and stuff like that, the torture that got the information about who was responsible for 9/11 and the first World Trade Center bombing and stuff like that, it turned out to be not accurate, because this is the problem with things like torture of any degree, is everybody breaks. Nobody can resist torture if it's done correctly, but that doesn't necessarily mean that you're going to be given accurate information or even correct information. People will tell you anything to stop it from happening.
I remember seeing a film, I think it was called Rendition, where the gentleman was subjected to physical and psychological torture, and he eventually gave a list of names, which I think was the Iraqi football team or something like that. When they later checked, probably just apocryphal for the purposes of the film, but no doubt based upon, because it invariably is the case that, particularly with physical torture, all it does is it'll break a person, but the information has no validity. When you were first talking about all this, Neil, it put me in mind of when I went to Dachau a number of years ago, and of course the experimental work that took place by Nazi scientists in relation to. So was there any link between the Nazis and the CIA?
Yes, in a couple of ways. One, at Dachau, they were doing mescaline experiments, which is right now the origin of where all this started is a little bit murky, right? Because America will say that they only got into the crazy area of mind control because the communists were doing it, Russia and China and people like that, and Korea, essentially, North Korea. They were saying that the people involved in the Korean War were coming back brainwashed.
And was there any actual evidence of that?
No, not really. What it was more sort of forcible, sort of like, people were under, like, I'm going to get my toes broken unless I go onto the television and say I denounce America and stuff like this. So it's not the thing. Where the concept of brainwashing came from was there was a book called Brainwashing in Red China that came out in the 50s by a man called Edward Hunter. And now Edward Hunter just so happened to be a CIA agent, and he popularized the concept that it was this mysterious force from the East, and it was connected to the previous Soviet purges and stuff like that. I mean, just going back to what you previously said, there was this concept from, say, like Laverne Berrier, bring me the man and I'll show you the crime, which is again the same thing. So you could say that that was essentially a form of brainwashing, using the threat of violence and stuff like that, because people will confess to that. But what if you actually start to look at it, say Chatter, which was the American version of masculine study, started in 1947, and in 1943 in the Middle East, it came out that the UK, there was a man called Alexander Kennedy, and it came out in Parliament many years later that he was using certain drugs on a captured prisoner in Egypt to try and induce essential brainwashing. But what happened with Nazi Germany was that they were doing the mescaline experiments, and there's a suggestion that Mengele, some of the things that he was doing with twins, and some of the things that he was doing with torture and sort of things were trying to induce that type of sort of response, like a trauma response so great that basically it broke the mind and made them quite malleable. So there was that concept. And also after the war, there was a thing called Project Paperclip, where a lot of essentially Russia and the UK and America swarmed on all these Nazi scientists, rocket scientists, people that have been working in medicine, in all sorts of fields. And they said, right, okay, look, you've got two choices. You can either go on trial or you can come and work for NASA or the NSA or the CIA or for various sort of institutions like that. And one of the most famous people was Wernher von Braun, who was in charge of the V2 rocket experiments, and then was basically taken over to America and became sort of very, very sort of influential in NASA in the space race. So in regards to those two things, the brain drain of scientists going over to America, and also sort of certain experiments that were taken from Dachau and also from Auschwitz were essentially just appropriated. Okay, we've got your data. Let's see what we can do with this. And so in that sense, there was a lot of Nazi involvement. But it's one of those things, everybody was trying to blame everybody else and claim that, well, we only got into this murky business because the other side were doing that. And often that's not true, or there's a hype around it or something. Another like area where they ended up spending like millions and millions of dollars for a very similar reason was psychic research.
Yes.
America became convinced that the Soviet Union had people that could read minds, people that could see into the future, people that could move things to telekinesis and psychokinesis and stuff like that. And the irony of it was none of it was true. It was all based on a book that was produced in America about Russia called Psychic Discoveries Behind the Iron Curtain. And off the back of this sparked a huge it's essentially $30 million worth of investigation over several decades, and it included such things as like hooking yogurt up to lie detector machines to see if they had emotions because it was living, that sort of thing. So yeah, they weren't averse to spending money on incredibly crazy things.
And do you think, because what strikes me there is when you say, well, we only started doing it because they started doing it, or, well, we better organize ourselves because we think that they might all have psychic powers.
Yeah.
Do you think there was a serious belief in that, or do you think it was more a case of, if we create this concept that they've got, that the enemy could do these things to us, we can then use that as an excuse to control our populace?
It's half and half, and in order for the latter half to justify it, then you need the people that the genuine believers. Like, for example, within say your mind control things, you had people like Morse Allen and J.G. Watkins and George Estabrooks who were sort of like convinced that hypnosis was the way forward, and then you had other people who were like, well, let's just see, and that sort of arms race concept of well, if they can do it, we better be doing it. There's an experiment that's done by this chap called J.G. Watkins, where he got all the sort of top brass out, and he did a live hypnosis experiment. And the two things that he did was, one, he managed to get this. He convinced somebody that a superior officer was the enemy and told him to attack him. And they thought this was fine because, you know, we're all trained soldiers and blah, 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 blah. So if, you know, they'll get into a tussle or whatever. And unbeknownst to him, this guy had a knife hidden in his boot. And so he stabbed the officer and had to be dragged off. And then later, or he attempted to stab him. I don't think he actually stabbed him. And then later in the presentation, some woman started revealing the details under hypnotic trance, started revealing the details of some secret fuel cache that had been sort of hidden away that was absolutely completely classified. And she was sort of just telling this entire room, and some guy who was like a particularly high ranking officer from the back of the room literally ran through the crowd screaming for them to stop this because it was so effective. So that sort of tends to be what happens. You get people that are doing it and very, very close to it, and then people that are just sort of convinced. And there's a degree of bias. Some of the results are very, very impressive. Like, some of the things are like, wow, okay, they actually got, like with the Morse Allen things, where they're getting people to actually like recordable responses where like, wow, this is crazy. Like that we could induce them to assassinate people like this. Now, with all of these things, you're going to get the people that are quite close to this having an element of bias because like they want it to work. Do you know what I mean? So any result, there's a thing called subjective validation, where essentially you look at the positives and tend to ignore the negatives.
Yes.
And there's certainly a degree of that, but the flip side to that is with the mind control, they kept processing it and kept doing things, and ultimately it was supposedly discontinued in the late 70s. But if you look at it, because what they did was they tended to move from sort of drugs onto hypnosis, and then from hypnosis onto machinery, which psychotronics is usually sort of the broad term. And this would be things like utilizing beams and microwaves and stuff like that to induce emotion, or something called synthetic telepathy. And synthetic telepathy is essentially exactly what it says on the tin. There's various different ways that you can do it. One way that was interesting was called the Smirnoff pattern, and the Smirnoff pattern was a device that shot what would be called subaudioal acoustic waves at people, and essentially the one time that they were going to use it was during the Waco siege. Now, I don't know if people remember the Waco siege, but basically like the Branch Davidian had been stockpiling guns there because they were selling guns, and this rubbed the authorities up the wrong way. There was a bit of a sort of back and forth. The ATF essentially ended up shooting at this compound, and then was it the ATF? I think it was the ATF, and then a standoff happened. And this went on for ages and ages and ages, and eventually the FBI were brought in. And one of the things that they suggested doing was using the Smirnoff pattern on David Koresh, who was the leader of this religious organization. Now, what they suggested that they would do was they were going to beam the voice of God into his head, telling him to abandon Mount Carmel, Waco, and come out peacefully. And they even went so far as to getting Charlton Heston to record the dialogue or the monologue of God that they would beam into his head. And the way that they would disguise this was by revving the engines, and also, and this was the thing that they actually did that people, you can go back and watch, they would play ridiculously loudly. They did two things. One, they played Welcome to the Jungle by by Guns N' Roses over and over and over again, and the other thing that they did was they played the sound of rabbits being murdered, so screaming rabbits as they're being as they're having their throats slit. And the idea was that they were going to beam this recording of Charlton Heston as God, telling David Koresh to come away peacefully. At the last minute, they got sort of cold feet because Smirnoff, who was the guy that invented the machine, said there is a slim chance that this might go wrong. And I said, well, what happens if it goes wrong? He said, well, they'll all go insane and they'll murder each other. And they said, well, you know what, we probably shouldn't do that then. And they decided to to solve the problem in a far more humane way by setting fire to the building.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So it all worked out in the end, didn't it?
Yeah, everyone was it all was fine. Yeah. So, but yeah, so yeah, this is the thing. And again,
have you ever found, Neil, that with all these different concepts of mind control, the use of the different drugs that you've talked about, LSD, mescaline, etc. That interesting example you just found there with the trying to sort of project the voice of God into Koresh's brain, so he thinks he's being told. That one area of mind control, which is regularly successful, is the relationship between a cult leader and cult members.
Yes.
Has there ever been? I know that there are many people who are involved in retrieving people from cults and helping them afterwards. But has there been any actual studies utilized by government agencies as to how cult leaders brainwash and control their cults, and to try and use that in any way? Do you know of?
Kind of, yes. I'm sure there has that I'm not aware of. And I mean, it depends where you want to go with this, because like there's certain for example, the Moon is the Reverend Sun Myung Moon, and the Unification Church, which was the cult that he started. That was started by right. The Reverend Sun Myung Moon was an informant and an asset of the KCIA, which is the Korean Central Intelligence Agency, and he so essentially, and the KCIA was essentially ran by the CIA. So he's an asset of the CIA. He started the Unification Church with two. And I'm going to forget their names. I think one was Yashimara and Hasimara, two Japanese fascists who were also under the auspices of the OSS, which is the Office of Special Services, which was the precursor to the CIA. So the the Unification Church of Sun Myung Moon was started with 3 CIA assets. And the interesting thing about the Unification Church of Sun Myung Moon is that basically they were heavily involved in, I'll give you examples, right? They sent thousands of people to various areas to register to vote in order to essentially stuff the ballot boxes for George H.W. Bush and George Bush. They run the newspaper, the Washington Post, and they're incredibly connected to the Trump campaign. Since Reverend Sun Myung Moon died, there's an arms firm called Kea Arms, and there is a cult that is ran by the son of Reverend Sun Myung Moon. And Donald Trump Jr. is a friend with this guy, and they've done loads of things, and they have a take on Jesus that is unusual, shall we say. Essentially, they have the image of Jesus on the cross with a golden AK-47, and they tie this religious organization in with their arms group. And so okay. Like, the suggestion is that this is still CIA. What cults do, right, is they offer you several things. They tell you exactly how the world is. This is up, this is down, this is right, this is wrong. Mm-hmm. The way we escape this reality is we jump on the comet, the UFO that's trailing the Hale-Bopp comet, and we do this by castrating ourselves and leaving our earthly bodies, stuff like that. So they tell you exactly how the world is. They tell you your position in the world. Like, you're number 5, you're number 6, you're Thetan operating number 7. So, your position, and you're surrounded by like-minded people. And those 3 things give you incredible psychological comfort. And so what that tends to do is that tends to bleed into other things. So if people might be listening to that and going, hang on, that's what I get from my Mercedes car. I know my place in the world. I'm the sort of person that drives a Mercedes. I'm not as successful as the person who has is the top of the range one, but I'm more successful than other people. And I'm surrounded by loads of other people who also think that the Mercedes are really cool. And so that bolsters me psychologically. And so through that, the mechanism is understood. Now, there's also a suggestion that certain cults now, the Reverend Jim Jones, the mass sort of killings in, I forget where it was, I think it was Guyana, where they were all induced to, the People's Temple, where they were all induced to take poisoned Kool-Aid. There's a suggestion that had connections to the CIA. And that it might have been an experiment that had gone wrong. But yeah, the concept of using cults, using cult figures, using organizations to induce people to follow, all of that stuff has been studied a huge amount. And people gravitate to groups, or can be induced to gravitate to groups. There's even the concept of the Gustav Le Bon idea of individuation, or the hypnosis of the crowd, where essentially, if you're in a large crowd, this is how riots happen, or how people, you tend to sort of give yourself over to the group for 2 reasons. One, you're protected, because you're part of a massive organization, and 2, you're literally swept up with the fever. And so when you see, the example is hockey fans who sit there drunk out of their mind, managing not to fight with their opposition who are sat right next to them for the entire year until they win, and then they decide to set fire to their own city. And nobody can quite explain it except for the fact that you're caught up in the moment.
Yes.
And by utilizing that, that absolutely works. And there's a thing called astroturfing, which is the concept of fake grassroots organizations that are there seemingly to give sort of like help to activist groups, or the people, the citizens, people that are interested in some type of movement, environmental, social issues, that type of thing. And then you find out that actually this group has been given seed money by some sort of great big nefarious organization, and actually utilizing that in order to say get you on side and turn you against something else, or whatever. So again, so a lot of these types of things have been very well organized. Interestingly, when you come to that concept of groupthink, and what we were saying earlier about isolation and overstimulation, is the concept of two things, right? Okay, one, social media and keeping people in it, and also altering their perceptions through that type of thing, and two, data mining, which can then be used, because the more I know about you, the more avenues I have for manipulation. Very, very simply, if I know that you're scared of spiders, then that's one way I can scare you and I can manipulate you. If I'm collecting thousands and thousands and thousands of data points, then there's all sorts of information that can be used to manipulate you. And there was a program called Cambridge Analytica, which was connected to things like Palantir and Peter Thiel and the Mercer family and SQL. SQL was a data mining organization that was basically bought by the Mercers and turned into Cambridge Analytica. Cambridge Analytica's motto is data-driven behavior change. And say what SQL and Cambridge Analytica did was two things. One, they had a List X clearance. A List X clearance means that they hold classified data, top secret and higher, which means that they are military intelligence. And two, Cambridge Analytica is considered weapons-grade communication tactics and is under an export license. What does an export license mean? An export license means that it has to be checked out with certain members of the government or the military before it can be deployed, because it is a weapon to be used against civilians. Two of the most prominent campaigns that Cambridge Analytica was used of in recent times were to convince people to leave the EU. The Brexit campaign used Cambridge Analytica, and to convince people to vote for Donald Trump. Donald Trump's campaign used Cambridge Analytica, which is interesting because both of those things were framed, certainly in the realm of the internet, as anti-establishment and upsetting the apple cart. But if you know that Cambridge Analytica exists, and you understand that Cambridge Analytica was essential to both those campaigns, and you understand that Cambridge Analytica was A, List X clearance, and B, under export control, that means that certain members of the highest ranks of the British government, American intelligence, and British intelligence wanted those two things to happen. Otherwise, they would not have allowed their weapon to be used to make it happen. And that is one of the most impressive. This is an actual provable. There's evidence, there's receipts. This is a mind control program that has actually been used against members of the public in recent times, and it was incredibly successful. I mean, look at the sort of, if we're going to sort of touch on your previous question, look at the cult of Trump. All you need is to say certain words, and then you've got him on side. You could take that even further. The concept within the conspiracy world that George Soros is like this puppet master that just so happens to like echo sort of ancient anti-Semitic canards and stuff like that. The concept of setting him up as a supervillain was actually done by two lawyers that were working for Netanyahu and the Israeli version of Cambridge Analytica called Black Cube, and they created the concept of Soros being this sort of puppet master as a way to bolster the Netanyahu campaign. And since one of them has actually died, I think Birnbaum and I can't remember the other guy's name. Feinstein or something. Anyway, they've basically, one of them died and the other ones came out. Finkelstein and Birnbaum, that was the name. And one of them's come out and said that they absolutely regret this. But this is the power of those things, because those programs, because they create a version of reality through fake news, through echo chambers online, through the dissemination of dis and misinformation. And it's all there to mold people into a particular way. And ultimately, the people that basically benefit from this are the people at the top of the, for want of a better phrase, top of the pyramid, government, essentially. And the irony of it is, particularly when you take it to sort of extremes with things like QAnon and stuff like that, people think that they're involved in some sort of group that is making the world better by fighting pedophiles or whatever, and it's nonsense. It's all just nonsense. It's a manipulation program. And the boring thing about it is, like, once you sweep away all the sort of like tunnels under the White House and adrenochrome and reptilian aliens and all of this rubbish, it's really to get people that aren't interested in politics to vote in a particular way. It's wrestling for politics. It's politics for people that like wrestling, and that's not a slight at wrestling. And that's I think I mentioned this before. The Vince McMahon and the WWE were part of the Donald Trump campaign, and they advised him to act like a heel, by which I mean like a villain character, like essentially Stone Cold Steve Austin. Like he's an anti-villain. He goes against the organization that is Vince McMahon, but ultimately, he's a good guy. And that was the character that Donald Trump played, and this was bolstered by all of these things, that essentially utilized the concepts and the understanding of how people react to cults.
Okay. Now, with all of that, and I know it's a huge topic, and there's so much that can be written and said about it, but we've got the likes of Sidney Gottlieb and the likes of Abramson and Cameron and people who were involved in all of the MK Ultra, and we talked about cult leaders, David Koresh being an example of that. You've got Scientology. I spoke to many people who've escaped Scientology and the methodologies that are used there. The way that certain individuals in the government think, right, we can use this propaganda, the way that Cambridge Analytica has been utilized. What do you see in terms of the personality types of the orchestrators of these schemes? What do you see them as?
Well, they must. There's I suppose a couple of ways of rationalizing it. Either they believe that it's for the greater good, and so they see themselves as potentially sort of custodians of society, or alternatively they don't care. And again, this depends who you speak to and who you sort of look, because there's plenty of people that you could find that were influential in sort of dictating how rulers work, that have a great sort of dislike of the unwashed masses, like the herd, like, do you know what I mean? And but similarly, you could probably find some people who genuinely think that they're actually sort of doing things for good. I would suggest.
Well, I mean, let's take, for example, I know there's the law of the internet in relation to him, but you take Hitler, and I often explain to people that he was a true believer. So with the Rus and the Slav, he saw them as subhuman. So he saw nothing wrong with the liquidation of those individuals to create Lebensraum for the German people. He believed in it. He didn't, at the end of the day, pour himself a whiskey and go, well, Adolf, you've been a real grade A shit today, gassing all of those people. To him, he believed what he was doing was right. So, and you will find that these individuals invariably always believe that what they're doing is right and correct. And you can take two opposing ideologies, and the proponents of those ideologies both believe that they're right. A classic example of that is like in the Second World War. If you believe in God, whose side was God on? Well, the Nazis believed he was on their side, and the Allies said he was on their side. Well, that's because both believed that they were right in what they were doing. And that type of personality very much falls within the field of my kind of people, whereby you must have that control over individuals, and that you see the world through a different reality to other people that drives that belief, allied with an absence of emotional empathy for people. Because if you deem that it's appropriate to wipe out huge sections of a particular type of person, you don't have any emotional empathy for them. You don't have a conscience. You believe in what you're doing is right. And that the drivers behind that, you'll invariably find narcissists and psychopaths.
Okay, that's very interesting. There is a concept as well that, like, when people are sort of explaining, sort of like, say, the classic example is your far right extremist or whatever, like that, you know, as you just pointed out, that want to eradicate the Jews. They don't think of themselves as bad. They think of themselves as necessary for something that's even worse. Now, that I'm not saying that that's correct, obviously. In fact, it's entirely incorrect. But yes, I could see that. Like, it's interesting that you say that as well, because Sidney Gottlieb, who was the person that was sort of overseeing the MK Ultra, I wonder if this falls into your sort of thesis as well. He was an incredibly driven person. He was born with a club foot, which he was told that this would basically be, you know, debilitating for the rest of your life. As an adult, he was an expert ballroom dancer and an expert tennis player. So he seems to be one of these people who's like, I don't care what people think. I'm going to achieve in this way. And would that sort of tie in with that type of personality?
Quite possibly. You will find that people who have emotional empathy will get themselves into positions of power, but they may find themselves making what are viewed as the difficult decisions particularly hard for them, because, I mean, taking a lesser example, you have a situation at work where Hank is going to be made redundant, but, you know, Hank's just had his 4th child and he's worked there for 20 years. There'd be certain personality types go, well, that's a shame for Hank, because, you know, he's got a new child and, you know, he's got 4 children, and where am I to get another job? Whereas the individual has no emotional empathy, he's very focused on the business needs to survive. Hank is underperforming, therefore we can get rid of Hank. I don't give a rat's ass about his personal circumstances. So then if you amplify that onto a national scale, the individuals which are actually best suited for getting into that position doesn't necessarily mean, and I know people will say that doesn't necessarily mean that they're good for the nation, but the ones who are better aligned to making decisions, which are the difficult decisions, you know, for instance, decisions about, as it was said, that when the Enigma machine found out about, they broke that we've got to let some losses happen,
so they don't realize,
so they don't know that we've broken it until we can use it effectively. Now, there'd be some individuals that would be able to have emotional empathy and make that decision, but they'd find it difficult. Somebody devoid of it would see the almost like the utilitarianism of it far easier, you know, the greatest good for the greatest number of people, and believe, that's what we've got to do. And so those type of personalities are actually best suited, because they're the ones that make the hard decisions, which invariably come with leading a nation. Now, a lot of people say the downside of that, of course, is that they'll take you into wars which are based upon their desire for control, and that they don't care about the populace so long as it makes them effective, and so forth. And this is why you get with Donald Trump, basically what's good for him is good for America. And so consequently, there'll be certain things that he will do which will be very effective for America. Then there'll be other things which he'll do which won't be, because of the personality type that you have. But it certainly strikes me that with many of the individuals, because as narcissists, the narcissist needs that control. It's fundamental in the outlook of the narcissist, for the most part subconscious. So all narcissists use, in effect, a degree of mind control over the people that they ensnare through the love bombing. You're wonderful, you're amazing, I've never met anybody like you, let me take you to this place, let me buy you this thing, I'll give you lots of great sex, etc. So it brings that person under control, and then, having got them under control, and they then enter the sustained devaluation, that person still remains under control. Rather than go, I'm being abused, I'm getting out of this relationship, they stay in it, because they have an addiction to the narcissist, and they're still subjected to the manipulation. Certain people would walk away from it. That's why I was interested in, when I was talking about susceptibility of people to it. that there are certain people who are more susceptible to being controlled than others, that they have a personality type which makes them easier to control and easier to remain in control. And so because it's part of the narcissist DNA to control, if you just amplify that, controlling your spouse, controlling your sibling, controlling your friends, it's those type of individuals and personalities that would look to not only control a nation, but think, how can I get people to tell me what I want? How can I get people to do what I want? How can I activate an assassin to take out my opponents? How can I ensure that I was told the truth? So I'd be interested, if I was to analyze these people. I haven't, for instance, with the likes of Gottlieb and so on and so forth. But when you talk about in very driven, that's not the sole preserve of narcissists, but you often see that with certain narcissists because the desire to succeed allows them to assert control over people. And the fact is, you say at a club photo, I think he had a stutter as well, didn't he?
I think so, something like that,
yeah, that afflicted him. So to overcome all of those things, it takes a particular type of personality. And the fact that you deem that it's appropriate to inflict what is essentially harm on people by giving them drugs without their consent, other forms of mind control, I think with MK Ultra was like electroconvulsive therapy, wasn't it? And things like that. And again, like that, I actually remember listening to a program, and I wish I could recall the details with greater particularization. It was a woman, and she was American, but she ended up living in Canada. And it was linked to MK Ultra. You touched on it about
Linda McDonald. I think.
That's it. That's the name. Yeah, really interesting program where she's got large sections of her memory missing.
Yes. Yeah. That was at McGill Institute in Canada. There was Ewan Cameron, and essentially what he was doing. This is where it gets even more sinister, because the things that he was offering was called depatterning, and it was sold as a therapeutic cure for people with postpartum depression, or just sort of general sort of malaise, that type of thing, and stuff like that. And it kind of worked in as much as it totally wiped their mind and personality, but it brought these people to a state. For example, Linda McDonald, she can't remember her children or her husband. She's shown pictures of them, and she understands that these people were special to her at some point in her life, but she has no connection to them. And what Cameron would do would be a combination of isolation, LSD, and electroshock therapy, and then combine this with this repatterning, and repatterning is like something out of a sci-fi dystopia. They put headphones on that cannot be removed, and a voice would repeat a phrase over and over again. Now, initially, when they started it, they got the patient to record the voice, and this would send people into psychosis, because apparently there's nothing worse than hearing your own voice criticize you like for days and days on end.
Yeah, that's right, because it was the case. It started off by saying something like, "You're a bad girl, you're a bad girl, you're a bad girl," and then they changed it, didn't they, to a positive outcome.
And the idea was that it got rid of all these harmful old patterns and introduced new patterns. But the problem is that essentially you just turned people into a vegetable, and then had to rebuild them right from the start. I mean, Linda McDonald was at the point where she was reduced to the state of an infant. She was incontinent, couldn't speak, no recollection of anything. Now the irony of this, speaking to sort of the concept of narcissism and stuff like that, is that whilst this was going on in Canada, there was a guy called William Sargent at St Thomas's Hospital in London, was doing almost identical experiments, although he utilized what was called a sleep room and narcosis, so was using drugs in what he described as Herculean doses, and he would basically put people into induced comas. Apparently this guy was desperately indiscreet, and he was trying to basically like sleep with all the nurses, and so he would basically tell them that he was like a spy, like akin to James Bond, and he was doing all this secret stuff that you can't really tell anybody about. One of the people that went to William Sargent was the actress and comedian Celia Imrie. She was in Calendar Girls. She was a patient. She had very, very mild depression, and she was a patient of William Sargent's. But there's two concepts that sort of tie back to narcissism. The one that basically that these people are doing horrible things to people, like, and they're convinced that for whatever reason it's worth it, either for
Yes.
and I don't even think it was the sort of the sold explanation that it's going to cure you of your depression. This is for MK Ultra stuff. This is this is to help the nation. It's just that these poor pregnant women are the people that actually sort of like are the guinea pigs, so to speak. And the second point is there's a fabulous quote. Ewan Cameron was very proud of what he'd achieved, and he was talking. He was sent, I think, he was in correspondence back to William Sargent or somebody that was close to him. And William Sargent was asked, like, what do you think of Ewan Cameron? Do you know, you must be incredibly proud, or it must be incredible to see what he's achieved. And William Sargent turned around and says, tell Ewan, whatever he achieved, I thought of it first.
Ah.
So
you are, you see.
Yeah.
So you've probably got two competing narcissists there, whereby, you know, thinking, oh no, if you're praising him, I can't have that.
Yes.
Because if the suggestion that somebody else has done something is anathema to the narcissist, because the narcissist will say, no, actually, I got there first.
Totally.
So I thought of it. So it's quite clear that the driver behind many of these individuals involved in the concept of mind control, because it is instinctive to the narcissist to control people through a variety of manipulations on a one-on-one scale, you know, controlling the spouse, controlling the friend, controlling the colleague as part of their fuel matrix. It then follows that they will believe also, of course, there's a degree of magical thinking in these individuals. I have the power to cause this to happen. I'm the one that's brilliant that can bring about the subjugation of a nation to control in this way, and the absence of emotional empathy to basically decide it is right and proper to inflict this form of testing and torture on individuals because I deem that it's appropriate. Now, not every individual that's involved in it will be a narcissist. There'll be some who'll be taken up in the groupthink that you were talking about earlier on, whereby their emotional empathy gets dialed down because they simply think, well, this is my job and I have to do it, and if I speak out about it, there'll be consequences for me. Or it seems on balance that, you know, no pain, no gain kind of thing. We have to do this if we're going to beat communists and so forth.
Yeah.
But the originators of all of this will have come. The true believers, you'll always find that the true believer is an individual who is the narcissist, because they have an altered reality compared to anybody else that's grounded in the necessity of control. So it's very interesting to hear about all of these different methods of trying to control people through, activating assassins and mind control programs, using drugs, using electricity, all of these different things, the torture techniques that are utilized. You know, you'll find, for instance, you know, when it came in with the waterboarding, etc. And I think it was two psychiatrists, wasn't it, that were hired, who made a shitload of money by advising the defense outfit in the States to do that. You'll have found that those individuals were likely to have been narcissists because they didn't deem what they were doing as inappropriate. They had no moral compass in that regard. They were motivated by the need for success, the need for control, the money that they were making. And that's the personality that's behind it.
So would you say that, like, Eichmann was a narcissist, like, you know, the banality of evil, that sort of reduction of people to sort of like, you know, things, or is that slightly different?
Because we view people as objects. They're appliances that are there to serve our purposes. We don't see people as a human being that has hopes and fears and desires. It's all about utilization. It's all about utility. What can this person do for me?
So does that tie in with why Eichmann sort of, you know, Nuremberg or whatever, he didn't really think that he'd done anything wrong. He felt himself more of a facilitator than anything else, and just because
because with these individuals, the narcissism essentially tells them that what they do is right, and so their lies are their truth. So one thing it was interesting that I was going to touch on earlier was the fact of, when you talk about a truth serum, and of course there isn't really any such thing, is there?
That's an interesting point.
Is that if you think that it will force someone to tell the truth, but if their truth is grounded in a different reality, they're never going to tell you the truth as you understand it to be. They will only keep telling you their truth because of perception.
That's interesting actually, because like there is also a certain type of person that is um won't be hypnotized. Well, again, there's debates onto this, like because you sort of your George Esterbrookes will tell you like I can hypnotize anybody, I don't care what you do. There are methods and stuff where you can induce somebody to be so
Yeah.
exhausted or whatever. But I had it when I was doing it as a for therapeutics and stuff like that, where people would turn up and they wouldn't allow themselves to go into it. They would sit there and be like, I can't be hypnotized, I can't be hypnotized. And after about 10 minutes you'd go, well, no, of course you can't if you don't want to be. Like,
Yeah.
and I wonder if that is an indication of that type of personality.
Well, I think it actually goes further than that, Neil, because
Mm,
let's take, for example, you get a bump on your head,
mm,
okay? And now you see the color yellow as green, and you've always understood yellow to be green. So I hold up a banana and you go, that's green. I hold up a
mm,
canary and you go, that's green.
yeah.
Your reality is that the color perception of yellow is now green. So if someone keeps saying to you, but that's yellow, isn't it? You're incapable of saying that it's yellow,
Mm.
because in your truth it's
But
green.
it's not.
I
Yeah.
suppose you might get to a point where you might then tell a lie in your world by going, okay, it's yellow because you can't bear the pain any longer.
Just in order to go along to get along and stuff. Like, yeah.
In order to get away from it. But you're not actually offering up any truth there. In your world, that's a lie, because you know it to be green, but you're just going to say it's yellow to stop them putting crocodile clips on your balls or whatever it is.
Well,
So,
again, and this, it ties back into the thing. It's like, is torture ever really effective? It's sort of like,
yeah,
yes, it is, but only by accident, really.
yeah, absolutely. Well, Neil, thank you very much for sharing your thoughts about mind control and MK Ultra and tying that all into narcissism. Very interesting. Thank you for sharing your thoughts and all of that, and having another conversation with me.
Oh, thank you very much. It was an absolute pleasure.